seated. Yes. And let's bring in the jury.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Sir, Judge, I'm wondering if we may have the overhead turned on. Sir, when we left off, we were talking about the second, or prong number 2 under the C, factors for post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that's not something that you found, correct?
Number 2, no.
And so that brings us up to number 1, correct?
Yes.
And this section is called persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and the numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma, as indicated by 3 or more, correct?
Yes.
And the first one, what does that talk about?
Talks about efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma.
Okay. And you found this one, correct?
I did.
And what efforts did she, according to you, undertake to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma?
I took her original story as an effort or an occurrence that separated her from the realities of the trauma. And by creating this other story, it created a psychological distance between what happened that she was responsible for and what she first claimed happened when she was the victim of this, well, obviously false story about what had happened on that day.
So what you're talking about under number 1 is a lie. She told a lie, and based on the fact that she told a lie, that was her effort to avoid feelings, conversations associated with the killing.
I'm not characterizing it as a lie.
You're characterizing it as a story.
As a story, a defense mechanism.
You call it a defense mechanism, but this defense mechanism, as the way these things have come out, based on what you tell us about what was told later, is a story, isn't it?
Yes.
But there are other things that she did during this period of time that affect this. Are you familiar with the fact that she sent 20 irises to Mr. Alexander's grandmother?
I don't remember the number being 20, but I do remember that, yes.
And in fact, if she admitted to that, that's not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the killing, is it?
It's an effort to distance herself from the reality of the fact that she did the killing.
And that effort requires thinking, doesn't it?
Yes.
So in her thinking about the 20 irises, she's thinking about the killing, right?
She's thinking of the event and the actions of maintaining normalcy as a result of what had happened, in my opinion, it's very similar to what happens in a dissociative identity disorder, where a whole alternative reality exists. Now, I didn't use that diagnosis here, but as part of her defense mechanism, I believe that she created this alternative reality which insulated her from the pain of dealing with what had happened that she was responsible for, and carried on as if the alternative reality was the truth.
So bottom line is, she did think about it, right? And that's why she thought about the killing, and that's why she sent the irises, right?
I don't know whether she thought about it. There's no way that I can say.
Well, then why else would she send 20 irises unless she was thinking about Mr. Alexander being dead, whether it be by one story or the other?
Well, obviously sending the irises was in response to him being deceased. That's true.
Right. And she knew, according to you, there was 1 or 2 realities, right? She knew that either these 2 people came in and killed him, or she killed him, right?
Right.
So she's thinking about the trauma then, right?
Not thinking about the trauma in terms of her being the actor or the person who did the killing.
Right. She's thinking about the trauma in terms of somebody putting the gun to her head, though, right?
That's correct.
So she is then thinking about the trauma, right?
A trauma, right, a trauma.
Right, the trauma that she designated in the PDS, right, under number 4.
Correct.
The other thing that she did with regard to this is that, isn't it true that she went on national television with a show called 48 Hours, right?
That's true.
She did it on 2 occasions, right?
Yes.
And during those 2 occasions, she talked about her thoughts, her feelings, and had a conversation associated with the killing, right?
Yes.
So now we have 2 examples where she's thinking about the killing, right?
Well, we don't know what she was thinking.
You don't think that when she's asked about Travis Alexander by a correspondent that she's not thinking about the killing? What could she possibly be thinking about then?
The alternatives to the fact that she killed him.
But she's thinking about the trauma. He's dead, right?
She's thinking about the trauma, that's right.
This here just says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. It says that, right?
That's right, it says that.
And that comes straight from DSM-4, right?
That's right.
And you said that that was the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
And so it doesn't say, with regard to the trauma, it doesn't say whether she killed him or not, does it?
It also doesn't say absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. It says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Efforts. These efforts may not always be successful.
And that's not my question. My question here doesn't distinguish the trauma, does it?
No.
Which is the point that you were trying to make to me with regard to the PDS, right?
Correct.
The trauma doesn't matter, right?
In that case, yes.
Yeah, so does it not matter with the PDS and it does matter here? Aren't you being a bit selective?
I'm not sure I understand the point you're
Sure,
trying
you do
to make.
understand the question. The PDS, you told us it doesn't matter what the trauma is, right?
At the time that I scored it, correct. Yes.
Well, no, even now you're telling us when you testified that the trauma doesn't matter.
The trauma did not matter. It was her
Right.
it was her internal perceptions of the emotional reactions to whatever trauma occurred, which is what I measured.
And the trauma doesn't matter is what you said. And so you said you could still use that test and don't have to rescore it because the trauma doesn't matter. That's what you said
That's
in
right.
response to a jury's question, right?
Yes.
So if that analysis applies for the PDS, you're saying, that analysis does not apply to the DSM-4, even though the PDS was used to corroborate the post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I'm afraid I'm not getting the point.
Sustained.
Sir, you did use the PDS to support or corroborate your finding that this was post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
And you said, with regard to that, the trauma doesn't matter, right?
Yes.
With regard to this, by its own definition, it says effects to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
It doesn't say first or second story, does it?
No, it doesn't. It talks about the trauma of being either, at one point, an observer to the killing or being the actor in the killing.
Right. So when you start trying to make this distinction with me about she doesn't know whether or not she killed him, it's just trauma that we're talking about, whether or not it was her that killed him or somebody else, right?
That's the point I'm making, yes.
So we get back to the 48 hours interview when you're saying, we discussed this and the question was, well, isn't it true that she discussed thoughts, feelings, conversations associated with the trauma in the 48 hours interview?
Yes.
So, again, that speaks against what's in number 1, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I don't see it that way.
Right, you wouldn't see that way because you have feelings for the defendant, right?
I beg your pardon, sir.
Jose, the objection?
It's argumentative, totally
Thank you.
inappropriate.
We approach, Your Honor.
You may.
You don't see it that way, right? It's your opinion, right?
Yes, it is.
And
As well
this-
as my professional opinion.
It's your professional opinion based on these 35 years that you've been telling us about, right?
That's correct.
Sir, one of the other things that we know in this case is that the defendant spoke with Leslie Udy. You're familiar with that, right?
Could you refresh my memory?
Sure.
Mr. Udy?
Objection, Judge Bianco.
Approach, please.
So we had information that the defendant, after traveling to Utah, spoke to Leslie Udy about Mr. Alexander. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the questions I think that you might have addressed involved the fact that she told Miss Udy about the fact that her children were going to play with Mr. Alexander's children. You remember that?
I do.
That's not avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
Well, it is.
How could it possibly be? Because isn't the person that was killed Travis Alexander?
It was.
Isn't it true that Travis Alexander was the subject of that conversation that we just discussed?
Yes, but she could not have had that conversation if she was admitting to the fact that she killed him. And so her conversation was her way of avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. At that point, the trauma in her mind, her perception, was that she did it, no matter what she told me.
But isn't it true in that conversation that she's the one that brought up Mr. Alexander? Are you aware of that?
Well, I can only aware of what I read. I don't know for sure.
Overruled.
Are you aware of that? Yes or no?
I don't know if she was the one who brought it up, but there was a conversation to that effect.
Let's assume that it was her that brought it up. Wouldn't that be contrary to what we have listed in number 1?
No, sir, it would not be.
The other thing that we know is that she sent the letter to the family. Are you aware of that?
To the whom?
The family of
Yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes, I am.
Again, she sent this letter to the family talking about the killing, right? You've read that, right?
Yes.
It's an 18-page letter, right?
Yes.
And it's a very long, detailed letter, isn't it?
Yes.
That doesn't show, she had to go to the effort of addressing it, didn't she?
Yes.
She had to go to the effort of getting it mailed, right?
Yes.
And she had to go through the effort of finding the address, right?
I don't know whether she had the address or not, but yes.
If she did have the address, she would have to have addressed it, correct?
Correct.
So that is not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or associations, conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
It is, if the trauma was killing Mr. Alexander.
Well, no, the
Because-
trauma here, again, we keep going back to this. Isn't the trauma that Mr. Alexander is dead? By whatever means?
Well, that's one aspect of the trauma, but the reality is her experience was that she did do the killing, and her perceptions and her emotions are tied into what actually occurred, not the story that was made up as a way of separating herself from the horror of what had happened on that day.
Going back to the PDS, you told us that the trauma didn't matter for purposes of your assessment, right?
That's correct,
But
because
you're
what the
right.
PDS measures were her emotional states and her perceptions of the trauma, whatever happened. And at the time that it was administered, she was telling this alternative story, but the reality was she was responding to the emotional components, which is what the PDS measures, as a person who did commit this crime.
And killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Involved what?
Killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Yes.
Whether it be by her hand or somebody else's hand, it involved trauma,
That's
right?
right.
So this is what this is talking about, whether her hand or somebody else's hand, isn't it? It doesn't distinguish, it doesn't say, but the trauma has to be associated with the killer killing the person, does it?
Objection asked and answered.
As I indicated earlier, the trauma involved the killing of Mr. Alexander. She experienced that regardless of the story that she was telling at the time. And so her psychological reactivity and her psychological defense mechanisms were helping her avoid the thoughts, feelings, and conversations associated with her having been the perpetrator of that killing.
My question is, trauma doesn't distinguish between the killer or somebody who was a witness, does it?
Well, that aspect of the trauma, correct. That's correct.
Does not. The other thing that we know is that you've read her journals, right?
I did.
And you've read the journals post-killing of Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And in it, she goes out of her way to talk about Mr. Alexander, doesn't she?
Well, it's for the exact same reason.
But the bottom line is she does go out of her way, which, of course, expresses her thoughts and feelings in that journal, right?
Correct. But
About the trauma, right?
Yes.
The other thing that we know is that Mr. Alexander had a memorial service. I believe she said either July 15th or July 16th are her words. You're aware of that,
I
right?
am.
And she attended the memorial service. You're aware of that, right?
I believe so.
And if she attended that memorial service, certainly that is not an effort to avoid thinking, feeling, or talking about the trauma, is it?
It was her way of avoiding dealing with the fact that she was responsible for that trauma by allowing herself to go through life at that time in a manner consistent with having been a victim of the trauma. Not dealing with the fact that she did perpetrate the trauma.
Now you're adding an extra element here, responsibility, aren't you? You're adding responsibility to the word trauma, aren't you? You're saying, well, she's trying to deal with her responsibility in this issue, and that's how she chose to deal with it.
Perhaps I misspoke there.
And this is irrespective of responsibility, isn't it?
An individual's inner perceptions is not independent of the nature of the trauma.
And all of this is based on what she told you, right?
That's correct.
And so you know that she goes to the memorial service, so she has to think about going to the memorial service, right?
Well, yes.
And so she has to book a flight, right?
Yes.
Did you know that it was a flight that
No,
she
I didn't
took?
know it was a flight when she got
Do you
there
want to see the
somehow.
receipt?
Pardon me?
Do you want to see the receipt that shows she took a flight?
I don't need to see the receipt.
All right. The other thing is, it requires that she make her way from the airport over to Mesa, which is where she told us the memorial service was. It requires some thought there, right?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not she went over to the house during the time that she was here at the memorial service?
I don't know that.
And if she had gone over there, wouldn't that indicate something to you that she is doing anything but avoiding thoughts about the killing?
I don't know that she went to the house.
But assuming she did, if you assume that she went over to the house with somebody named Aaron, assume that, wouldn't that indicate that she was not attempting to avoid thinking about the trauma?
If her actions were part of an avoidance reaction, a defense mechanism, a dissociative reality, then it would be consistent with going to that site because she wouldn't have been responding as if she was the perpetrator. And so, again, I don't know that she did go over there, but if you have something that I can read to confirm that, I would be appreciative.
That would make a difference for you?
Well, I'd like to
if,
see
for
that. Yeah, I
example,
don't
somebody
remember.
named Aaron Mortensen went over there with her?
I beg your pardon?
If somebody actually went over there to the crime scene with her afterwards? That would
Well, I'm at this point, I don't recall what the details were. I'm assuming that you're a man of your word, and what you're telling me is actual, so I'll go along with that.
But here again, we're talking about trauma. It doesn't distinguish between responsibility. It doesn't talk about responsibility. It just talks about trauma, doesn't it?
Well, there are different kinds of trauma, and there
Right.
are different
And-
levels of trauma.
And you've told us that it doesn't make any difference in the trauma experienced by a police officer, right? It doesn't make any difference, does it? If it's a police officer or her, right? In terms of PTSD.
Well, it's a person's reactions to a trauma that determines whether or not they develop PTSD.
Didn't you just tell us when you were asked by the jurors, there was a question involving, are you saying that the defendant's PTSD is the same as that of a police officer? And you said that it was?
No, what I said was that it met the same criteria. It's not caused by the same factors,
Right.
but it has the same characteristics. Indeed, all cases of PTSD all fall under the same diagnostic criteria.
Right, because the trauma doesn't look at the responsibility of it, does it? In other words, it doesn't look as to whether you are rightful in doing it as opposed to wrongful in doing it, right?
It has an impact on one's perceptions of the intensity of the trauma.
Right. But whether or not a person has this intensity of of this PTSD, it is PTSD, whether it's slight PTSD or strong PTSD, right?
Correct.
So when you say that the police officer's PTSD may not be as strong as hers, it's still PTSD, right?
It still falls under the diagnostic
Right.
criteria, yes.
Right. So that the trauma, in other words, whether you are killing wrongfully or rightfully, in your mind, it's still trauma. That triggers PTSD, right?
Both would be trauma, but of a different nature.
Sure, but it's trauma, right?
Yes.
And the same analysis applies to somebody in war in Afghanistan. You told us that, right?
Yes.
As it does to the defendant, right?
Yeah, in terms of the diagnosis of PTSD.
Sure. And C1 illustrates that point, doesn't it?
Correct.
So, with regard to that, one of the things that we know is that she talked in the journals about Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
She talked over and over about him, didn't she?
Yes.
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled. That's not an avoidance of feelings or thoughts about him, is it?
Yes, it can be, because if she's talking about him in flowing terms and how wonderful he was, it's a way of insulating her from the harsh reality that she did the killing. And so that method of dealing with his demise is very different than someone saying, oh my gosh, I've done this horrible thing, and I take all full responsibility for that. It's a different way of dealing with a similar situation. But it's very different in terms of the internal perceptions and in terms of the emotional reactivity of the client.
It requires thinking to write down what she did in her journals, right?
Yes.
And it requires thinking about the trauma, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Irrespective of whether it's rightful or wrongful, it requires that. So there was nothing that required her, for example, she wasn't attending a course in school that required her to write in those journals, right?
Correct.
It was a voluntary effort on her part, correct?
She has used journal writing as a way of dealing with her life since she was in school.
That's
This
not
is an
my
extension of that. This is not a new activity.
It's not my question. Nobody forced her to write in those journals,
No
did
one
they?
forced her to write.
And it required her to think about it before she wrote whatever she wrote in those journals, right?
Answer.
Sustained.
Well, and it wasn't that she just had one entry in there. She had many entries, right?
Yes.
And she continued on up till at least a day or two until her arrest, right?
Correct.
The other thing, sir, is that shortly after this killing, the defendant called Mr. Alexander's answering machine. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
That's not an effort to avoid thinking about the trauma, is it?
It's consistent, however, with her psychological condition of having created an alternative reality which allowed her to function in life because it was a way that she was able to deny having been the perpetrator of the crime.
In terms of that telephone call, it required her to pick up the telephone to make the call, didn't it?
Yes.
It required, whether or not she had him on speed dial or otherwise, it required her to manually do something by pushing at least one button, correct?
Sure.
And it required her, while she was on the phone, to speak, right?
Yes.
And so, even though the trauma had already occurred, it required her to express her thoughts, feelings in a one-sided conversation on the telephone, right?
She did do that.
Additionally, didn't she also send an email?
Yes.
And this email was sent to Mr. Alexander's account, wherever the account was, right?
Yes.
And so that required her to think about sitting down and composing an email to him, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And she sat wherever it was that she sat, and she actually had to type in his name, a first letter, or however it worked, to at least get that going, right?
Yes.
She had to print out the words, right?
Yes.
And then she had to actually push the send button, right?
Yes.
If that's the case, then she's not avoiding thoughts, is she?
Those actions are consistent with someone who is avoiding the thought of having been the perpetrator of the killing.
But is she thinking about the trauma? I'm not asking about... It doesn't say killing there, right? Does it?
No.
In fact, it could be a car accident where nobody was killed, right? So trauma just indicates the event, whatever that event was, right?
That's right.
The other thing is that, didn't she also send some text messages over to him?
I believe so.
And these text messages were after the killing, right?
Yes.
She wasn't avoiding thinking about him when she sent those text messages, was she?
It was a method that is consistent with her behaving in a way that reduced the impact of the trauma on her, because by engaging in that alternative behavior, she was not having to get in touch with her feelings of responsibility for his demise.
She was trying to stage a scene, is what she told us.
Well, that's what she did. She didn't tell that to me.
Mischaracterizes her testimony.
Overruled.
Wouldn't that be inconsistent if that's what they're doing, staging a scene? Wouldn't that be inconsistent with avoiding thoughts? In fact, you're actually really thinking about the trauma then if you're trying to stage a scene, aren't you?
Well, that was not told to me.
Well, let's assume then that that's what she said, that she was trying to stage the scene. Wouldn't that indicate that just the opposite?
Not necessarily.
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
You may. Stating the last objection, the jury is directed to disregard the last question and answer. You may continue.
Sir, with regard to avoiding responsibility, isn't the idea, if somebody wants to avoid responsibility involving the trauma, actually the antithesis of what you have here?
No.
Avoiding responsibility on something, isn't that saying something that you are thinking about the trauma, but you just don't want to be held responsible?
It doesn't say responsibility. The criteria do not say responsibility.
It does say efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
And if someone's thinking about their responsibility, isn't that contrary to avoiding thoughts associated with the trauma?
Yes. There's a difference, however, between the trauma of observing someone being killed and recognizing that you killed the individual.
And I understand that you keep saying that, but the DSM-4 doesn't say that, does it?
The definition of trauma is not contained within that particular criteria.
I understand that now you're trying to be a wordsmith involving trauma, but
Characterization.
Sustained.
with regard to the word trauma, are you saying that the word trauma means specifically that it has to apply to somebody who killed somebody unlawfully? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
of course not.
Right. It can be lawful or unlawful, right?
Correct.
Just as in the example that you gave in Afghanistan where a soldier kills somebody, right?
Correct.
That's a lawful killing, right?
Yes.
As opposed to another killing outside of this courtroom where somebody takes a gun and shoots somebody, right?
That's right.
And so trauma applies to both of them, doesn't it?
It does, but there's a different essence to each of those traumas.
And-
People react emotionally differently to those types of traumas.
They may react emotionally differently, but anybody who is diagnosed with PTSD has to walk through these portals here in DSM-4, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you ever work for the military?
Not extensively, no.
Well, do you have any information about how the military does its thing with regard to diagnosing somebody with PTSD?
Objection, on the scope.
Approach. You may continue.
Doesn't the military, when they, if you know, when they diagnose somebody with PTSD, don't they follow the criteria in the DSM-4?
Yes.
Same thing with a police officer that you've talked about, maybe in the Times article that you talked about. If that officer was found to have been diagnosed with PTSD, he would have, by necessity, have been diagnosed pursuant to DSM-4, correct?
Right. I don't believe the officer was diagnosed with PTSD, however.
But assuming that he had. Oh,
Yes.
you said that you've worked with police officers
Yes, the
before,
same
right?
criteria would apply.
So one of the other things that you talked about was this email or this instant messaging involving the defendant and Mr. Alexander, where he called her 3 salacious names. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you also remember the other part of that conversation where Mr. Alexander was upset and he told her...
Objection, Judge. Maybe approach.
Do you remember saying that you reviewed a conversation where the victim, Mr. Alexander, called the defendant certain names? Do you remember that?
I do recall that, yes.
And it was Miss Wilmot that asked you that, right? Do you
Yes.
remember that? And you were able to tell us that you had actually reviewed that, right?
Yes.
But as part of that same conversation, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was upset and said, do you remember reading that he was nothing more than a dildo with a heartbeat to Miss Arias? Do you remember reading that part?
I did.
So that's part of the same conversation, isn't it?
Well, I believe it occurred in the same time frame.
No, not the same time frame. Do you want to take a look at it and see, to refresh your recollection to see?
Yes,
what
that would be helpful.
This is Exhibit 275. Go ahead and take your time and read it. This is that, and then the other one's there.
Okay.
I want you to review the whole thing to see if it includes those words previously also. That
The other
or do you-
words?
Or do you just recognize it by looking at it?
No, I read the part that you had
Go ahead
referred
and
me
take a
to.
look at it and find the other section.
Okay.
You may want to start at the beginning.
And what is it specifically you're asking me to find?
I'm just asking you to read it to see if it's the same conversation where he used those 3 names so that
Okay.
we can follow up.
Okay, I did come across the three-hole wonder.
Sure. Don't just read it. Did I ask you to tell me? Just read it, okay?
The
Once
whole
you're done
thing?
reading,
Okay.
let me know.
All right, I didn't want to take up the first time.
And in terms of where the complaint by Mr. Alexander appears, would you say it comes, the way you were reading it from this way forward, that it comes after he makes the derogatory comments about her?
I think it came after.
Well, why don't you take a look, okay? This thing about So his comments about her came after the derogatory comment about himself being a...
Objection, Judge. These are out of sequence. We just discussed.
Approach, please.
And so these statements were made as a part of the same conversations, weren't they?
Yes.
In fact, he's complaining to her about her taking advantage of him sexually, right?
Objection. Beyond the scope, relevance.
Overruled.
Right?
Yes.
And, sir, does the date of this conversation, the one that you reviewed prior to coming to court, did it have a date on it?
I'm sure that it did, but I don't remember the date.
Was the date important to you?
Well, the relative time frame was important, yes.
And the one that you read did have a date and time, right?
I believe it did.
Take a look at Exhibit 275 to see if that, it may or may not refresh your recollection as to the date and time of this conversation.
$526.08.
Well, without saying it, did it refresh your recollection or not?
Honestly, no.
Okay, then that's fine.
Doesn't remember.
Okay. One of the things that you talked to us about in response to a juror question was this fight or flight syndrome. Do you remember
Yes.
talking about that? And one of the things that you said was that, and you analogized it to animals. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
That the first thing that happens is there's this flight, correct?
There's an impulse to flee.
Right, and that's the first thing, in your opinion, that happens, right?
As a rule, yes.
And then if the animal can't get away, cornered, so to speak, then there's this instinct to fight, right?
Yes.
And this fighting is instinctual, is what you said, correct?
Yes.
And however, with animals, as soon as the fight is over, the vanquished is gone, then that ends the encounter, doesn't it?
Yes.
The winner, if you will, of this battle, whatever it was, doesn't then stick around and do other things with regard to the other animal that it's vanquished,
Objection, Your
does
Honor.
it?
Overruled.
Typically not.
Typically no means they just go about their business after that, right?
After recouping from their wounds, yes.
If they have any wounds, right? They may not have any wounds, right?
That's possible too.
So what they do is they're done, they move, and they go away, right?
Yes.
And they don't stick around, nosing around to try to take advantage of the dead carcass or anything like that, right?
Well, some animals kill for food.
Right.
And so
No.
they would consume the carcass.
But that's not the situation that we have here. According to you, we have a situation where there's an attacker, right? And then the other animal flees first, right? According to what you explained to us, right?
In that hypothetical,
Right,
yes.
that's what we were talking about. In that hypothetical, once the winner is determined, let's assume by death, they don't stick around, do they?
No.
They take off, right?
Yes.
Could it be, sir, that in this particular case, with regard to everything that we've seen, for example, your finding of PTSD, some of your findings of the elements and your scoring of the PDS and your Milan test, could it be, sir, that you looked at those results and because of the fact that it appears you're not objective anymore, that perhaps that could have colored the way you viewed your conversations and your results under the PTSD?
What could have colored my opinion?
Didn't you tell us that you had compassion for the defendant?
We're trained in empathy. Psychologists are trained in empathy. That is, the capacity to get into the minds and feelings of the client, to assist them, and to help understand when you do an evaluation. It is not necessarily compassion, even though Webster may say that. It is certainly not sympathy. And we are very, very carefully trained not to allow our empathic listening to lead us into any kind of over-identification with the client. That is what psychologists are trained for, sir. We are trained to be neutral observers of either an evaluation situation or when doing psychotherapy in a psychotherapeutic situation. We are trained not to over-identify with the client. It's crucial training.
Do you remember in a response to a question and follow-up by the defense counsel that you said that you had compassion?
I have been accused of being a compassionate person.
And sir, didn't you also say, when you and I were talking about it, that you felt sorry, at least during that first interview with the defendant?
No, I didn't say I felt sorry.
Did you use the word sorry in connection with the first interview with the defendant?
I don't remember saying that.
Do you remember that you used the word sorry when we were discussing the Webster's definition?
Well, we were talking about semantics at that point, so I may have, but that's not the context in which you're using it now.
Is that yes or no? Do you remember using the word sorry?
I don't remember using the word sorry.
And with regard to the word compassion, do you remember that you were the one that introduced it into this conversation?
That's right.
And isn't it true, sir, that this, to use your word, compassion, entered into your evaluation in this case?
No, what I said was that I have been accused of being a compassionate person. Empathy factored into this evaluation, as it would with any person I work with, because we are trained to be empathic listeners, but we are also trained to remain completely objective in doing our work, whether it's psychotherapeutic or evaluative.
And you're saying that you were trained to have this empathy, right?
I don't think that people are trained as much as a tendency to be an empathic person is brought out and then reinforced and modified by our training.
You were saying, though, just now that you were trained to have empathy for the person that you are assessing, right? Isn't that what you just said?
We are trained to become empathic listeners.
Empathic listeners means you have empathy, correct?
That's right. We use empathy as a tool for evaluative purposes and for therapeutic purposes.
And in terms of this empathy or this compassion, whatever word you want to use, this is part of your training, right?
Yes.
Isn't good record keeping, for example, such as detailing what it was that you found with regard to PTSD and writing it out, isn't that something that's also, for example, exhibit number 544? Isn't it also part of training that you're accurate as to the subsections that you're finding and when you write them out? Isn't there some training for that?
Well, absolutely.
And isn't there some training that indicates that that being accurate is one of the things that's sacrosanct in this business?
Yes, I omitted a few letters and numbers, and the rest of my report, had it been read, maybe I'm sure you read it, is filled with accuracy.
I'm saying, though, isn't that part of your training?
Yes.
Right? Isn't it also part of your training in the PDS that you need to score it effectively or accurately, right?
Accurately, I did score it accurately for the portions of the test that were pertinent to my use of the test.
I understand, but you came up with 3 different numbers. You came up with 15, 16, and 17, correct?
Those numbers didn't matter because I did not use that data, and it had nothing to do with the use of the PDS test as a confirmation for my diagnosis.
Yes or no? 15, 16, and 17 are 3 different numbers.
They are 3 different numbers, yes.
And you are taught to be very accurate with regard to the results in these tests, right?
And if the results were critical, they would have been checked several times.
Sir, isn't it true that you are trained to be accurate in your results?
Yes.
Sir? So that you've been telling us with regard to this issue involving the defendant and that you had received all this training about having empathy, compassion, but not letting it affect you, right?
Yes.
And you've also been telling us about the training and how the training is with regard to recording and how you attempted to follow that, and in your 35 years you had training in how to keep reports and records straight, right?
Yes.
You weren't successful with the records and the reports, were you? You weren't accurate.
A typographical error is not equivalent to being a neutral, empathic listener.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking, although you had training, you still failed in being accurate. We're looking at exhibit number 544. You weren't accurate there.
I admit a mistake was made in typing.
And just like you've had your 35 years of training, you made a mistake, Just like you had your 35 years of being compassionate and empathic, isn't it true that in this case, you lost your objectivity?
Objection.
Absolutely not.
Overruled.
Absolutely not.
I don't have anything else.
All right, looks like we have one additional juror question. Are there any other questions from the jury? Counsel, please approach. Ms. Wilmot.
Dr. Samuels, you were just asked by the state about the conversation that occurs by instant message that you were just reviewed.
Yes.
And you were asked about whether or not you remembered the statement that Travis or Mr. Alexander felt like he was a dildo with a heartbeat, right?
Yes.
You have also, in review of this case, you've listened to an audio tape of basically a sex tape, right?
Yes.
Where they're having phone sex.
Yes.
And during that conversation where Mr. Alexander is talking about what he wants from Miss Arias and talking about his particular sexual desires, anywhere on that tape does it appear that he feels like he's being used?
No.
Anywhere on that tape does it appear that he didn't want to have any conversations like phone sex like that?
No.
Did he ever appear unwilling?
No.
You were asked questions about avoiding the trauma and avoiding the trauma of killing Travis
Yes.
just a few minutes ago. If she's avoiding the trauma, that means does that mean avoiding thinking about what actually happened?
She's doing anything in her power to avoid reacting emotionally to what has happened.
So, in doing so, if she has a conversation with Leslie Udy about something that can never happen, like Travis's children playing with Jodi's children someday down the road, is that avoidance or is that thinking about the trauma?
It's not thinking about the trauma. It's more like avoidance of the trauma.
And why is it more like avoidance?
Because it's dealing with an unreality. It's not dealing with the fact that I killed Mr. Alexander. It's a way of putting an obstacle between what's going on in her life at the moment and the reality of what happened.
And in going to the memorial and paying her respects at the memorial, is that a way of avoiding what actually happened?
Absolutely. It's living in a fantasy world.
And when she journals after June 4th, and she journals about nice things about Mr. Alexander, trying to remember him in a nice way, is that avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
Yes.
And when she calls him and leaves a voicemail, she's not talking on the voicemail about what just happened, right?
Correct.
Sustained.
Is she talking about on the voicemail what just happened?
No.
No, and is she, in fact, talking about things that didn't happen?
Correct.
And is that avoiding the reality of what she did on June 4th?
Yes, in my opinion.
Same thing with her email.
The same thing with my email and my professional opinion, yes.
And in sending flowers to Travis's grandmother, again, like showing respects at the memorial, is that something that is avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
It's avoiding coming to terms with what she was responsible for on June 4th.
Okay. You were asked questions about her being suicidal,
Yes.
and with regard to her journal writing, did she express bouts of depression?
Yes, she did. She suffered from bouts of depression.
All right. And to your knowledge, was there ever any type of intervention or anything needed during her high school because of any type of suicidal thoughts?
To my knowledge, there was never an actual suicidal attempt.
All right. And once you spoke to her after June 4th of 2008, what was her ideation about suicide at that point?
Well, she didn't have a specific plan, but she said it was part of her plan not to live long enough to go to trial.
And if she were to have written letters to her family members saying goodbye, and have written a letter where she drew a tombstone and wrote what she wanted to say. Is that further evidence that she's actually thinking about suicide?
Yes.
Sustained.
It was, may we approach?
Sustaining the objection, jury is directed to disregard the question and the response. You may continue.
Dr. Samuels, if you were aware that Miss Arias wrote letters to her grandmother to pass out to her different family members saying goodbye, is that further information that you would use to support the idea that her suicidal ideation is stronger after June 4th?
Yes.
Not in evidence.
Overruled.
You remember when Mr. Martinez was playing a clip of you during an interview that you had with Mr. Martinez?
Yes.
And he didn't show you the transcript, did he?
No.
And he didn't play the entire interview for you before court, right?
No, he did not.
And he just played the clip in court?
Yes.
And he was asking you questions about whether or not Miss Arias had difficulty falling asleep. Is that right?
Correct.
And ultimately, what we heard on the clip was just very short about that now she's able to get sleep.
Correct.
Okay. Judge, may I approach?
I'm going to check since he hasn't indicated he didn't remember any. He hasn't any. It's improper impeachment.
Well, there's no question before the witness. You may hand the document to him and then ask a question.
Okay, well, then let's do it this way. All right, Dr. Samuels, do you remember during the conversation that you had with Mr. Martinez during the interview, did you talk to him about the tranquilizers?
Yes.
And did you talk to him about Miss Arias taking those tranquilizers for 8 months?
Yes.
And did you talk to him about taking those tranquilizers, that she took those tranquilizers when she, just after June 4th, when she was initially arrested?
Yes.
And that she had to take those tranquilizers because she couldn't sleep?
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
And so the tiny clip that we heard was just the tail, is that just the tail end of this conversation during the interview?
It was.
And just that tail end of the conversation of the interview, is that just talking about how she felt after she took 8 months of tranquilizers?
Yes.
But you didn't get to review this when Mr. Martinez was playing the clip for you, did you?
No, I did not.
Relevance as to when he reviewed it and whether or not.
Overruled.
What was your answer?
I did not have an opportunity to review it prior to the clip being played.
He didn't show it to you, did he?
No.
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
You remember you were asked about the scoring for the PDS test?
Yes.
Okay. And I know this was gone over quite a bit, but it seems like you weren't able to always finish your answers. So,
Objection as to the characterization relevance.
Sustained.
let's talk about that for a second. You had, you were telling us something about those numbers 15, 16, or 17, right?
Yes.
Do those numbers make any difference with regard to whether or not the test confirms a diagnosis for PTSD?
No, they have nothing to do with that at all.
Why don't they?
Because they don't count in reaching that first level of criteria. What does count are the number of items that are checked off in a particular box by the client, and in each case, for each of the 6 criteria, or actually they were more, she met the foundation, the diagnostic criteria for PTSD before any numbers were calculated at all. Those numbers only impact the degree of symptom severity and the total number of symptoms reviewed or endorsed. I did not refer to those in my report. I was not interested in those numbers. What I was interested in, does the test support my contention that based upon all of my knowledge, scientific and psychological probability, that she had PTSD, and the answer was yes. It met it, and in fact, it exceeded it in each of those categories.
Now, those categories, when you're talking about, if the number was 15, does that make any difference with regard to the confirmation of the diagnosis?
No.
And you're talking about the different categories. I'm showing you what's been in evidence as Exhibit 550.
Yes,
Okay, so we're looking at A, B, and C, right?
that's correct.
Okay, so this is part of your scoring, right?
That's correct.
And this scoring is something that is specifically, are you trained to do this with regard to this particular test?
Yes,
And this particular scoring under A, B, and C, is this part of what helps to confirm a diagnosis of PTSD?
that's right. And then below, there's an area where you can check, is the criterion met for A, B, C, D, E, and F?
Okay, and I see yes, yes, and yes for A, B, C. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then on to D, E, and F.
That's correct.
So is it the same thing with scoring on D, E, and F?
Yes,
And then we look at whether the criteria was met.
that's correct.
And we see yes, yes, and yes.
That's correct.
So whether or not this number down here in criteria A through F, and we see that number 17,
Yes.
whether that number is a 15, 16, or 17, does that have anything to do at all with your confirmation of PTSD?
No.
Does it in any way help this test to be accurate or not accurate with regard to its confirmation of PTSD?
No, it does not.
Nothing further, Judge.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the afternoon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 10 minutes after 3, and we will get started promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Counsel, please approach.